Welcome. My name is Renee Miller. I'm the program manager at the Oregon Bioscience Incubator, and I appreciate you all joining us today to learn about licensing and tech transfer from Tonkon Torp. And we really appreciate their presenting and sponsoring this event today. And we're excited to hear more about it. So as we get started, I'm going to go ahead and just give a brief bio on our two speakers. We have Josh Smith, who's a partner at Tonkon Torp. His practice is focused on representing and counseling emerging and established companies on a wide variety of intellectual property, corporate, and transactional matters. He also counsels clients on venture capital and angel financing, technology licensing, commercial agreements, and general business matters, primarily in the technology industry. Josh is a magna cum laude graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School. We also have with us Andrew Weinberg, who earned his master's and PhD in biochemistry from Washington State University. He moved to Portland in 1990 to work at the VA Medical Center on an autoimmune model for multiple sclerosis. He joined Providence Cancer Center in 1995 as an independent scientist focused on tumor immunology. Andrew is the president and CEO of AgonOx, a spinoff company from Providence Cancer Center. And they're going to give a presentation today. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type them into the chat and we'll do Q&A at the end of each segment. So with that, Josh, are you ready?
I am, thank you.
All right, go right ahead.
All right, well, thanks, Renee. I understand we got a pretty good audience out there, and you know, it's always fun to talk about the topics of licensing and tech transfer. I will say, you know, depending on your experience, we're going to go at this from kind of a basic level. And one of the things I always like to do whenever I present on any sort of legal topic, you know, I certainly want to give you the nuts and bolts and the basics, but I also think it's good to give you a different perspective, someone that's not looking at it as a lawyer looks at it, but has lived and breathed it. And so that's why I invited Dr. Weinberg, and it's going to be interesting to get his perspectives having done that. And so let's see if I can get this slide to move. There we go. All right, well, let's run through again today's topics. Hopefully this is what you were expecting. We're going to talk about tech licensing basics. We're going to talk about different types of tech transfer agreements. I will walk through pitfalls and opportunities in connection with tech transfer generally. And as I mentioned, I think Dr. Weinberg, who has been a client of mine and as Renee mentioned, has a lot of experience with tech transfer and specifically with his Ox40 technology that he'll explain to you. I think it's going to be really interesting to get his insights. So we'll start out with him. Save your questions for him until the end of that session, which will be about 12:30. And then I'll dive back in and give you my presentation on those other nuts and bolts of tech transfer topics. So I was gonna, Andy, have you walk through your background, but Renee actually did a pretty good job of that. Anything you want to add, just as far as your experience prior to the Ox40 Discovery and the licensing work that you did?
No, I mean, just the fact that we started out in autoimmune disease and kind of discovered the pathway there, and then showed it was important in that regard, and then also in tumor immunology. So, you know, as an immunologist, there's typically enhancing the immune system, which is important for tumor immunology and the immune system in the case of autoimmunity. So anyway, so that's kind of a good background. And then I think for this talk, we'll just be discussing the tumor immunology aspect.
Okay, great. Well, let's dive in. Prior to discovering Ox40 and negotiating those deals with Providence and then the follow-on sublicense, had you had prior experiences with tech transfer or tech licensing generally?
Yeah, so initially when I was at the VA, and associated with OHSU, the Ox40 and the autoimmunity side of things, we had some experience dealing with a British company that was interested in licensing it for dampening autoimmunity. And then the interesting thing was, although maybe it wasn't so interesting, was that they wrote into the contract that anything else that came from the Ox40 side, they would have rights to license that as well. And that turned out to be the tumor immunology side. So we were involved with them initially, but I can go through the experience of what happened with that.
Okay, I mean, and when you first started, thinking about licensing issues and looking at licensing agreements, I mean, did you go through some sort of education, or was it kind of just on the job training? How did you initially come to appreciate all the various aspects of tech licensing?
Yeah, so I would say on the job training. I mean, I'm trained as an immunologist and biochemist, and certainly not in tech transfer or licensing. So basically, we learned from our lawyers and some of the tech transfer people that initially were at the VA, but then at Providence Cancer Institute.
Okay. Well, then why don't you tell us how Ox40 was discovered, and maybe give us a little better understanding, especially for those in the audience that might not have a background in this field, as to what it is and why it was important.
Yeah, so Ox40 is a TNF receptor, and I didn't discover it. It was discovered in Oxford, so hence the name Ox40. Maybe it was their 40th protein that they had discovered. But it's a TNF receptor, and it expressed highly and pretty much only on immune cells, mainly on the helper T cell variety. So initially, what we had done is shown that it was highly upregulated on T cells that got into the spinal cords of animals that were having MS-like symptoms, and this was called EAE, was the model. And then what we showed was if you blocked it or you deleted those cells in these MS models, multiple sclerosis models, that the disease went away. And so we initially wrote patents based on that. And so that was the initial discovery. And then we kind of moved to tumor immunology. I was working with a surgeon, John Vetto, up at OHSU, and he was giving us melanoma samples. And what we found was that Ox40 was upregulated in these melanoma samples. And that's kind of how I got involved with the tumor immunology side.
Okay. And ultimately, what was the hope with respect to, how it would help patients?
Well, initially, either blocking the Ox40 pathway would dampen immunity, and we had shown that and published that, or you could actually delete the Ox40 positive cells, and we showed that if you did that, then all the immune cells that were attacking the autoimmune organs went away. And so that was the initial discovery. And then for the tumor immunology side, what we found was that the tumor antigen specific cells were expressing Ox40. And so we produced an agonist antibody, which revved up the T cells or the TNF receptor Ox40. It increased its activity, and we got more tumor cell killing and survival of these tumor antigen specific T cells. And that led to tumors going away, at least in the mouse model, so that we then translated that into patients. I'm sure we'll talk about that in the next few questions.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So at some point you became aware of the potential, and you decided to go and form your own startup you called AgonOx. What went into that initial formation and your decision to decide to go off and commercialize this through your own company?
Yeah, so that's a long, involved question, even though it's a short question. But I guess my answer will be long and involved, and I'll try to keep it brief. But so AgonOx was formed. So initially, this British company that had rights to license it, any discovery we had in Ox40, we're trying to commercialize it on the tumor immunology side, and but they weren't really doing anything with it per se. And so it turned out Stanford also had some patents on Ox40, and this company had those patents as well. And Stanford threatened to sue them because they weren't doing much with the patents. And so basically they let everybody get their patents back that had anything to do with Ox40, which ours was one of them, or we had a couple of them actually. And at that time, we decided at the Providence Cancer Institute with Walter Erba, who's the head of the institute, was that maybe it would be best, rather than licensing this to a small biotech, is just to start our own company. And then we would be able to license the rights ourselves, independent of anybody else making those decisions. We felt like, we knew the field pretty well and some of the players, and we could do a good job of that.
And the idea of forming your own company and taking on that responsibility directly, I mean, is that something you had done before, or what were you skeptical of that initially?
No, I think I was more for it than against it. I mean, the one thing that I learned over the years is that large pharma doesn't really like to work with, let's say, a big institute like Providence or OHSU. They would rather work with a smaller biotech. And so I didn't have any trepidations with starting AgonOx. And the idea was that we could start AgonOx and start working potentially with, licensing this. And during that time, we had already performed a phase 1 clinical trial and shown efficacy, or at least in some of the patients. I think it was 12 out of the first 30 patients, we were seeing tumors go away. So I was pretty confident that we could do a pretty good job in licensing it ourselves through the company.
Okay. So you formed AgonOx. Providence had the rights you wanted. How did you go about structuring that initial license deal with Providence?
Yeah, so basically, as in most large institutes, there is an individual or tech transfer person involved with these types of decisions. And basically, all I did was say, okay, you guys draw something up and I'll look it over, and if I agree, then we'll go ahead and do the deal. And that's basically how it went. Because Providence, and like I said, Walter Erba was in step with forming AgonOx, and so I basically just took their license structure and showed it to a few lawyers, and we worked on it, and within a couple months we had it solidified.
But you basically let Providence drive the structure under their traditional tech transfer model. I mean, they were the ones that came up with the structure itself.
Absolutely. I didn't really do much to it.
All right.
And I think being a Providence employee as well, I mean, we would want Providence to benefit from anything that came of it.
Right. Okay. So that deal was put in place. What came next? I mean, at some point you found Metamune as your sub-licensing partner, but what went into that search to find Metamune? What transpired between signing the deal with Providence and entering into the Metamune deal?
Yeah, so yeah, that was interesting as well. So it turned out right when we were doing this clinical trial and seeing some effects with these antibodies, there had been 2 other antibodies, anti-CTLA4 and anti-PD1, which revs up the immune system and helps immune cells attack tumors, and they were showing clinical responses. And so, the Ox40 stuff was kind of the third version of these antibodies that had been out there and been tested in patients. And at one point, I think it was around 2010 or 11, anti-CTLA4 got approved in melanoma. And at that point, I mean, I didn't seek out any companies. I had companies emailing me. So I had 6 big pharmas emailing me and wanting to know, is it possible to license this and go forward? So interestingly enough, and I would argue that, that's usually never the case. Usually, you have a business development guy going out and trying to push things to the big pharma. And in our case, it was much simpler because big pharma was coming to us based on the results we were seeing in our clinical trial and based on the fact that immunotherapy was looking like it was showing really nice efficacy in cancer patients.
So you were in a much different situation. How did you go about evaluating the opportunities then that were being presented to you, and how and why did you select Metamune as the partner?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. I did hire a business development guy, Luke Keltner, who actually lived in Portland. And so I would basically, when I was getting emails, I would send them to him, and then we would just look at the numbers of licensing deals for oncology agents, right? So we knew kind of where the market was going for a license deal of something of this magnitude. And so we kind of just put our sights kind of in the middle of those dollars and said, okay, draw up term sheets based on, getting to milestones like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and percentages on the back end. And we were also looking for a partner that could really move it in the direction we thought would be a positive direction as far as getting it approved as fast as possible, but maybe testing it with combinations with these other immunotherapies that were different pathways, but we had shown in the lab had synergistic or additive effects. And so Metamune certainly was a company that had an anti-PD-L1 drug, and they had just licensed from Pfizer an anti-CTLA-4 drug. And so we thought marrying that with them would be good, as well as they came in with a really nice term sheet. So that's kind of how we settled on Metamune. But there was other companies like GSK and BMS and a couple other companies that were very interested in it.
All right. So looking back, how was your experience negotiating the deal with Metamune? Obviously, you'd had the experience with Providence. You kind of followed their lead, followed their structure. How was the deal with Metamune put together? I mean, obviously, you had a term sheet and some economics set up, but the actual negotiation, what was that like?
Yeah, so it's funny when people are coming to you, I think the negotiation's a lot easier. And we had certain things that we wanted, although I think in the end we might discuss this. We thought we had, like, if they were going to terminate the program, everything would come back to us and so on. And so all those things were kind of on the negotiating table. And a lot of it was favorable to us in the sense that they were more interested. I mean, they were certainly interested in putting this in their portfolio. And so, the negotiations went on for probably about only a month and a half to 2 months. And then once we basically were set with the term sheets, then the license agreement was started and was starting to be drafted by all the lawyers. And, interestingly enough, I'm a scientist and I don't really sit down at the negotiating table with lawyers, but I would have a pretty good idea of what was going on based on my business development guy who was in all the meetings with the lawyers. And so they would read back to me what Metamune was interested in getting, and then we would kind of go back and forth. But it was basically negotiated by the lawyers and my business development guy.
All right. So once that sub-license was in place, what happened next? Can you just walk us through the collaboration and whether or not you were satisfied with how Metamune, attempted to commercialize everything?
Yeah. So, I think at that point, we were done with our phase 1. And so so what you do in these types of situations is you set up a joint steering committee or a JSC committee meetings. and you kind of go back and forth about, okay, what are the next steps? The initial antibody that we used in the phase 1 was a mouse antibody, so it had to be humanized. And so Metamune humanized the antibody, and then coming up with a scheme. So what we argued was, well, we were seeing good efficacy in patients. So what we'd like to do is keep the same scheme, which was basically giving the antibody 3 times during a week. So kind of keeping the levels high during a Monday, Wednesday, Friday course. Now, Metamune had a completely different idea based on PD-1 and anti-CTLA-4, which are checkpoint blockades, and you just want to block the protein. The Ox40 antibody is an agonist, and you want to activate. So it's a lot different biologic activity and what you want to do with antibodies. But what Metamune wanted to do was just give it like CTLA-4 and PD-1 blockade, which was every 2 weeks until the patient either responded or recurred. And we argued that isn't the way these agonists work. But anyway, we lost. They won as far as that argument was concerned. And they started their trials giving it every 2 weeks. And so what we found in that type of scenario is the antibody wasn't nearly as effective. And ultimately, the trials were, while they did see some responses, weren't as acute or in the numbers and percentages as what we initially saw. So they ended up dropping it about 6, 7, 8 years later, something like that.
And so where do things now stand with Ox40?
Yeah, so as far as Ox40 is concerned, so and we've published a lot of our work in the patients, and even with the humanized antibody, we just had a paper come out in Nature Communications, giving it and looking at surgical samples and showing what happens in the tumors and so on. So there have been several companies, probably now 7 or 8 different companies that have made different Ox40 agonists. At this point, our antibody patents are no longer valid. So it's been the 18 or 20 years that you get. And so there's a lot of other companies that are now developing these kind of based on the protocols that we initially had. And interestingly enough, AgonOx has kind of shifted a little bit into cell therapies. So we've been doing what they call TIL therapy, similar to what Steve Rosenberg does at the NCI. And we've been able to kind of form a technology and patent the technology that seems to be a lot more specific. And we think potentially patients will respond with a higher percentage, at least for these TIL therapies. So we've kind of pivoted a bit. We're still interested in Ox40, and actually we've shown, and others have shown, that with cell therapies, if you give an Ox40 agonist, they work much better. So we'll probably revisit giving Ox40 with the cell therapies that we've started up, and that our initial trials on those technologies will start probably in the fall.
So you're still running AgonOx. You talked about some of the other technologies you're working on. What is your approach to AgonOx generally? I mean, how do you run it? What do you hope to accomplish there? I'm just wondering what AgonOx is doing today compared to what you initially expected that it would do.
Yeah, so we have a philosophy, which is probably different than most biotechnologies. We stayed away from venture capital. We tend to want to work with mid-level biotechs and also large pharmas. But the idea being is that our technology has to show biologic activity in patients for us to either license it or show efficacy in patients. So our idea is if we don't see efficacy in humans, then we're not going to gain from that, and certainly nobody gains from that, right? If I license a technology that I know does not activity, I may make money from it, but our society and people aren't going to gain from that. So, our philosophy has always been, if the technology shows that tumors are going away, then that's a great thing, not only for us as a company, but us as a society. And so we've taken that approach. So if the tumors go away with our technology, everybody wins, including AgonOx. And so that's always been our strategy, our philosophy, and always will be. And so if we don't see tumors going away in patients, then we kind of drop it and go on to something else. But with Ox40, we did, and certainly with this new technology, I think we will as well. But that's been our philosophy, and that will be our philosophy going forward.
All right. Well, I mean, with all your experience, including the AgonOx experience, I mean, what advice do you give to entrepreneurs looking to license technology from either an educational or other institution? I mean, what lessons have you learned?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously I've learned a lot. If you could turn back the hands of time, I would probably do things a little bit differently. It's hard once you've licensed something to a large pharma to influence them and tell them, okay, this is the way it should be, you should proceed. We had done initial phase 1 and saw some really nice effects, and we would have hoped that they would have basically kept on the same path that we had. And so, my advice would be, if you have something you think works and is showing efficacy in patients, is if you can get the wherewithal or the money to basically go through phase 2 and lay it on a platter for the large pharma. So basically, if you're seeing really good responses, keep it to yourself until, you force the big pharma's hand to do it exactly like you did. And if I had to do it over again with Ox40, I probably would have kept it a little bit longer, but hindsight's 2020, and the amount of money that we received from the license deal was really, really nice boon for us, and allowed us to do a lot of research that we wouldn't have been able to do, both on Ox40, but also on other fronts as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much. At this point, Renee, I think we were going to open it up to questions.
Yes, great. Thank you. That was really interesting to hear about a real world example of licensing and transferring technology. So we do have some questions in the chat. The first one is from Douglas Kawahara. He asks, what are your thoughts on the changes to march-in rights and conveyance of title to patent rights to the government under BiDole?
Oh God, I guess you'd have to explain what BiDole is. I know it's something about doing research. Well, anyway, maybe Josh.
Doug, you want to open your microphone and elaborate?
Well, I think as most of tech transfer people here know, BiDole is really what dictated the fact that you could actually out-license academic research, which you couldn't really do beforehand. But there were certain march-in rights and conveyance of title based on, and I think Josh is probably better positioned to actually state this in more accurate terms, but there's been recently, I don't know if it's actually been enacted or not, but changes to the march-in rights and title conveyance to the government due to certain defaults that used to be in license agreements. But maybe Josh could probably better answer this than either Andrew or I.
Well, I'm not a patent attorney, number one, and number two, as I mentioned at the beginning, the way we kind of structured this program was kind of as a bare bones, basic tech transfer. So I'm a little hesitant to try to get into that level of detail, but maybe shoot me an email as a separate follow-up, and I'll try to get your question answered.
Or maybe some of the people from OHU's tech transfer office may have seen this and might have some comments, like if there's anyone here from
Doug, this is Andrew Watson. I can answer, or I can talk to you offline if you want.
I just thought it would be something interesting for the group in general, because it does change the game of what's, and I think there was actually another question in here about losing rights, and that may or may not be from this as well. I think someone mentioned something about Stanford.
Yeah. Hey, Andrew, this is David Foreman. I think the group would like to hear your perspective on it.
Okay. Sure, I'll take myself off camera there, or I'll put myself on camera too. So hi, everyone. I head up the tech transfer office at OHSU. So yeah, what was proposed recently were some proposed changes by NIST, which is the National Institute of Standard and Technology, which now oversees BiDole implementation. BiDole was the piece of legislation passed in 1980 that gave universities, research institutions, small businesses, which received federal funding to actually claim ownership of their inventions. Prior to 1980, any inventions developed with US government funding were owned by the government, not by the institutions. So the couple changes that Doug is referring to that are being proposed, one is related to drug price, really kind of related to drug pricing. That the government does, in order to march in and take over a technology that was developed with US government funding, the sole reason for the government to step in cannot be to control pricing of the product that's being developed with that technology. So that's what the proposal is. And I think that's probably a good one, because I don't think the government, at least what I hear, wants to get into dictating what the prices of drugs and other products may be. The second change is related to the BiDole Act was changed a few years ago and could penalize institutions or small businesses who don't report their inventions and their patent filings and their elections of titles in a specified time manner. And these times actually got shortened a couple of years ago to timeframes that are very difficult from the academic technology transfer realm. And if you didn't report things in those timeframes, the government could come in and take the technology away. And so down the road, if you've licensed the technology out, there's that risk that the biotech or pharma company or whatever could have their rights taken away by the government. Those types of march-in rights by the government are also being proposed to be taken away. If a grant recipient doesn't meet their timeline obligations, which I can tell you probably happens more than 50% of the time across the country. So Doug, to answer your question, I think both of the proposed changes that came out recently are probably good changes.
Thank you, Andrew. That was excellent.
Great, thanks,
Any other
Andrew, for jumping
questions?
in. Yeah, we do. We have several. Rod Pittman asks, can you expand on the Stanford lawsuit? If you don't use it, you lose it. And how does that work?
So yeah, I don't. The Stanford law. I mean, I think I think he's referring to what Stanford and we had technologies, the Ox40 and Stanford did too. Is they just threatened. They didn't. There was no lawsuit, so and then once they threatened, the smaller biotech company just gave it back to everyone. I think that's what he's referring to.
Okay. All right, great, thanks. Charlotte Triplett asks, has the MS-related research for Ox40 continued to move forward?
That's a good question. So yeah, a couple things on that front. So I would say yes, in the sense there has been other companies. I haven't taken it forward. It turned out for our patent, which was depleting the Ox40 positive cells, we also had another patent for blocking its activity, that it was also expressed, Ox40 is also expressed on what they call T regulatory cells, which are involved with dampening the immune response. And so it's kind of this yin and yang of effector cells versus regulatory cells. But anyway, we found and actually in mouse models, it wasn't big a deal, and that's what we were working with. But in rat models, when we depleted OX40 positive cells, which we thought would only deplete the autoreactive cells, it would actually cause some more inflammation based on depleting Treg cells. So we kind of got out of the autoimmune business based on that. But,
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
David has a question. He says, it sounds like Metamune considered that Ox40 needed to have a similar dosing regimen to CTLA4 and PD-L1 agents in order to be commercially competitive. For a drug to be successful, it must meet both efficacy and other elements of a target product profile. Was that the situation there?
well, you know, they always explain it to us that if you were going to give them in combination, it would be more convenient for a patient to just come in and get all the antibodies at once. I mean, and I kind of get that, except for the fact that biology doesn't work that way. And so they're completely different pathways. And so what we've found and published on, this is in the literature now, and I think hopefully other companies are looking at this, is if you give the OX40 agonist first, and you give it this Monday, Wednesday, Friday course, and then 2 to 3 weeks later, what we see is there's lots of PD-L1 upregulation. And so we found in mouse models, if you give a nice burst of OX40 first, and then you come in with PD-L1 blockade or PD-1 blockade, it works much better. And there's not as much toxicity and so on. And so that was one of the trials that we had proposed to Metamune as the follow-on trial before they dropped the program.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that information. Andrea Adamson asks, can you describe your commercialization team and what roles were key to your success?
That's a good question. So really, my team was one business development guy and my lawyer, Josh. I think Josh was there, I think, so he saw pretty much everything that happened. So it was just two people and me. And you know, that was kind of based on the fact that this was a pathway that people were very interested in. And so we really didn't have to have an extensive group because we had a lot of offers, and we just kind of had to go through the offers and figure out, okay, what makes sense for us, and then, you know, have the lawyers negotiate the license. But yeah, it was pretty. And then the license deal, I did have a group of lawyers from Chicago that were biotech type lawyers that helped with the license deal.
Great, thank you. David,
maybe one more, Renee?
Go ahead. Yeah, there's one more question, and it's a follow-on to the BiDole situation. David asks, to date, has there been any BiDole actions related either to solely drug pricing or failure to report? Successful actions he's asking about.
Maybe, is that another question for Andrew Watson?
Happy to answer that. So to my knowledge, no, there hasn't been any successful step-in. During the past year, during COVID, there's been some possibilities of the government and suggestions that the government may step in on various technologies to take them over, but there hasn't been anything to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's it for the questions for this segment. I appreciate everybody's participation.
All right, great, thank you. And I think we're going to move to the next segment. So thank you again to Andrew Weinberg. Appreciate you walking us through your experiences.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Well, I'll tell you what, the sophistication of those questions has me nervous that this next segment may be a bit basic for people. I guess I, for some reason, had assumed that perhaps the audience was looking for kind of a boot camp around technology licensing and tech transfer generally, but let's give it a whirl anyway. So now the idea is I was going to walk everyone through just some tech licensing basics, right? I mean, obviously you saw from Andrew Weinberg how the technologists views license agreements and how they're approached in negotiating them. I thought I'd give you a perspective from a lawyer who negotiates them, what we want to think about, what we want to understand. And it's really breaking down a number of different components. So, number one, I hope everyone understands, or if you don't, you should understand what a license is generally, right? I mean, it's just a permission from a party to make some specified use of property. There's no transfer of title or ownership. It's just permission. And so that's what forms the structure generally of a technology license. You then need to figure out, well, what property is being licensed? And, intellectual property rights come in various shapes and sizes. And, we could have a whole lunch and learn walking through the various types of IP, from patents and copyrights to trademarks and trade secrets. But I do think it's important for an entrepreneur to understand the specific type of property that they're licensing. What rights do they actually need to commercialize whatever technology they're trying to commercialize? Licenses then come in different shapes and sizes, right? Exclusivity is important. That exclusivity has to be addressed as between the licensor and the licensee, as well as just to the licensee. There are also, cross licenses, right? I mean, typically when technology is licensed, it exists in some form at the beginning of the relationship, and as it's developed moving forward, there are derivatives, and license agreements will typically address how the license rights flow back and forth between the licensee and the licensor. And sometimes, there are joint development licenses. In Andy's case, for example, with AgonOx, once the license agreement with Providence was signed initially, there were ongoing joint development efforts. And so all the rights in the fruits of those efforts had to be addressed back and forth between the parties. But these are just some of the basics. You got to think through a license term, right? I mean, is this a perpetual term? Is it a license, just throughout the term of a patent? Is it for some different period of time? But that's always important. You got to think through what the specific use rights are, and restrictions and responsibilities among the parties. Sometimes license rights are allocated among different territories. We have to address the rights in, derivative works, as I mentioned, not only the technology as it exists on the day the license was signed, but, as it may exist once those development efforts have taken place. Sublicenses are always important, right? I mean, typically as the licensee, if you're going to form a company and attempt to go commercialize a technology, you are going to need the right to partner with other entities and be able to pass through sublicenses. And in the AgonOx example, Providence was the licensor, AgonOx the licensee, and the whole deal it struck with Metamune was through a sublicense. And obviously it got paid then from Metamune and turned around and paid Providence. Depending on the type of IP, as I mentioned, there's also IP protection issues. Who has the ongoing patent prosecution and maintenance obligations? Which party is going to enforce the IP rights to the extent that some third party is violating those rights? All those things get addressed in a technology license. The fees are clearly important, whether they're just periodic fees, annual fees, or whether they're royalties tied to actual distribution of licensed products, and whether or not sometimes there are minimums that will accrue after some period of time. But those are obviously important aspects of a technology license. And again, I think just based on what I've learned from the audience, I think I'm going to try to work through all these pretty quickly. So hopefully I'm not going too fast for those few of you out there that may actually not have any experience with this. Within any agreement, including a license, there's then risk allocation questions. Is the technology being licensed as is, or are there warranties regarding its compliance with specifications or performance in some respect? And is there indemnification obligations on the part of one party or the other related to any reasonably anticipated third-party liabilities that either the license or the licensee would have to be responsible for? But these are all kind of just the basics of issues that arise when it comes to negotiating a technology license. And I think the key for, if somebody is a first-time entrepreneur looking to negotiate a license, you obviously got to find yourself an attorney that understands this, walk through these various aspects with them, and just make sure that the agreement captures the arrangement between the licensor and the licensee as it should. Let me move forward a little bit. So tech transfer generally, right? I mean, obviously there are a lot of technology license agreements in place. If you think about transferring technology from some institution, that's typically done in the larger institutions through some sort of tech transfer program. And, as Andy mentioned, Providence, when he first negotiated his deal with them, it was obviously driven by Providence's tech transfer program. And, Andrew Watson is at OHSU, and OHSU has its own tech transfer program. Sometimes deals are struck as one-offs, and they're not, through a tech transfer program. But if you think about the typical tech transfer programs and the agreements that often result from participation in those programs, they often look like this. So there are a variety of agreements, and I just thought it might make sense to walk everyone through kind of the different types of agreements that may result. One is, if a company is not yet ready to enter a full license agreement and actually take on the obligation and the responsibility to commercialize the technology, they'll often enter into what's called an option to obtain a license. So for some period of time, maybe 6 to 12 months, there's no commercialization taking place, but that entity has the right to attain a license for some fee or subject to some set of conditions going forward. There are also often agreements that are called sponsored research agreements, where technology may need additional research or funding to get to the next phase, and so the parties will, rather than enter a license agreement or in conjunction with a license agreement, also enter into some sort of a sponsored research agreement where they continue to collaborate as necessary to advance the technology. Occasionally you'll see materials transfer agreements, where research materials are being shared. And so they are specific agreements designed to contemplate the sharing of materials and responsibilities in that regard. Occasionally you'll see what's called a facilities use agreement. So AgonOx, for example, as Andy mentioned, not a large group, and Andy is also an employee of Providence. And so what they did is they entered into a facilities use agreement whereby Providence leased or subleased a portion of its space to AgonOx for its operation. And then, as I mentioned, ultimately, the patent/technology license agreement is kind of the foundation of the go forward relationship. Let's just talk about some general pitfalls and opportunities in tech transfer. I asked Andy as the last question, what his feedback was for other entrepreneurs. These are just a few things that I wanted to walk through to remind entrepreneurs as to what may be important to consider when they're working through these programs. One is, tech transfer offices are great. Some are better than others. The programs, some are more sophisticated than others. At the end of the day, I think the reality is when you're dealing with bigger institutions, they're going to drive the process. They have the leverage. They have, programs and a bureaucracy in place that smaller companies and entrepreneurs need to learn how to navigate. At the end of the day, the deal has to make sense, though, for the licensee as well. And occasionally, there's a conflict, right? That program, the traditional structure, might work for the institution, might not work for the entrepreneur. And rather than just saying, well, this is the one and only path, I think being open to the concept that even if this is the program, it has to make sense from the licensee standpoint is important. Negotiating business terms is kind of tied to that. At the end of the day, the business arrangement has to make sense. The timelines, the fees, the obligations on the part of each party there is room to negotiate those. And yes, when you're dealing with a big institution, the flexibility may not be as good as it is in other arrangements, but getting those business terms right up front, I think, is important and worth the effort. Typically, when a licensee then is going to enter an agreement and go out and actually conduct the business of commercializing, they're going to have to form their own entity. And again, here's a topic that could take a whole lunch and learn session itself. I think, in fact, Tonkon may be presenting one in the coming future about how to form an entity and what the various types of entities are and how they're organized and how they may be funded. But that's an important step that shouldn't be overlooked. I think I mentioned a little bit with Andy, trying to get his perspective about how to negotiate an agreement. Obviously, it's typically the principal working with a lawyer, and they each come at it from different perspectives. But, finding the right resource to help in that process, making sure that upfront there's a little bit of time spent sorting out the objectives and what matters and doesn't matter, what's important and maybe less important for each specific opportunity, I think is really important. There is a notion sometimes out there that, these things are just canned, right? You just give me your template license agreement and let's get going. And I would caution people to not get caught in that trap. Faculty considerations, again, is a topic that can get nuanced, but you do have to be careful if the licensee also works for the licensor. And there are a number of considerations, but one specifically is just drawing the lines when it comes to IP rights. You're wearing your hat as a faculty member. Obviously, you're subject to one agreement. When you're working for your startup licensee, you're wearing a different hat. And getting those clear lines with respect to who owns what gets created, wearing each hat can be important. Having that collaboration and communication survive the license agreement, I think, is really important. As Andy mentioned, oftentimes there's a steering committee or some sort of ongoing collaboration process where the parties continue to work together. I think that's really important. And I guess I would just summarize by saying, going into any sort of entrepreneurial effort where you're going to form an entity, spin out some technology and go and commercialize it, I think really making sure you understand these various aspects and having realistic expectations up front as to what you're committing to, what you're protected against, what you're not protected against is just really important. So I think I will stop there and see if in our last 5 minutes or so there are any questions for me. And I guess let's just see if there are any questions. Renee?
Yes, thank you so much. And we have people attending these from anywhere from they're just thinking about an idea, so technology, to people who have been in the industry for many years. So we appreciate learning about the basics. Okay, yeah, we do have some questions. Andrea Adamson is asking, can you describe best practices for embodying trade secrets such as know-how and data into licensable form? And is this an area where an IP lawyer can assist?
Well, I'd say this, and I don't know if the focus here is primarily just, bioscience, but obviously, as I mentioned, it's really important to appreciate with respect to the specific technology that you're concerned with, which form it takes, right? Whether it's patentable, whether it's subject to copyright, trademark, or in this case, you're asking about trade secrets. I think it's probably more of a nuanced question that I'm going to be able to answer here, and generally. But I would just say yes, it's important to get an IP attorney to walk through with you how those trade secrets relate to your specific technology, your specific deal, and then to make sure, of course, that your agreement contemplates those, that you're getting the rights from the licensor that you need, and then on an ongoing basis, they're addressed properly, if that makes sense.
Okay, great, thank you. Rod Pittman is asking, if there are already over $1 billion in infringements, how should this affect your patent strategy or your potential license partner relative to patent protection, maintenance, et cetera?
If I understand the question, correctly. I mean, we're concerned with infringing activity. I mean, I think people have to be realistic. Companies have to be realistic that, you know, there is a risk, of course, in infringement and infringing activity. And, you know, obviously having rights under your patent and actually preventing someone from violating those rights, you know, are two different things. And so being, again, to my last point, realistic about what it will take to enforce your patent rights, I think is certainly something to consider up front, to walk through with your attorney and to make sure that ultimately, you know, you can get the benefit that that patent is supposed to be providing you.
Okay, great. I'm going to skip forward a couple comments. Emmanuel Akpore is asking how easy or difficult for a small startup to renegotiate a license that's more favorable for the startup.
Well, I think it depends on the situation, but it can be a challenge. And it's not just with respect to licenses, right? I mean, it's any time we're working with our small startup clients and they are asked to sign, you know, a big company agreement. And, you know, we have to be realistic with them around leverage and timelines and the likelihood of getting better terms negotiated or not. And so, you know, the way I typically approach it is that, you know, at the end of the day, you need to focus in on those terms that matter, be realistic as to the ones that maybe don't matter so much. But for those terms that do matter, even if it's going to be a challenge, even if the other party has the leverage, you know, trying to figure out the best way to address them and hopefully resolve them in a way that will work for you is important. And the idea that, you know, that agreements, whether they're license agreements or otherwise, you know, come in one shape and you know, our cookie cutter or standard is not the case. And so, you know, to answer that question more specifically, I would say you need to figure out in the agreement what matters, what doesn't matter. But for those things that do matter, regardless of the challenge, you need to take them on to make sure that you're addressing them. And ultimately, if you're working with the right partner, the right institution, and your approach is reasonable, you can typically find a compromise.
Great, thank you. We've got one more question, and while I'm asking it, I'm going to put up a poll. If the audience could please fill out this poll. It's just 3 questions. And the question is from Rod Pittman again. He is asking about your thoughts and emotions on utilizing a patent exchange for license or sale. And Trina chimed in that funding sources may not allow you to sell or license or assign a patent. So that may be not a possibility. And your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I need to better understand the type of patent exchange you're talking about. Of course, you know, your ability to do those types of things is going to be subject to conditions you've agreed to in your license. But yeah, I probably don't have enough experience specifically dealing with patent exchanges as I understand the question. And so probably have to leave it at that. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Well, we really appreciate, Josh, you and Andrew's appearance today and sharing a lot of really valuable information. And I appreciate everyone attending. I wanted to let you all know that we did record this session and we'll be posting it on our website and on our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it again and share it with other people. And we appreciate Tonkon Torp for sponsoring this event and bringing us this valuable information. And are there any last questions anybody would like to chime in? Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. So Josh, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your support of the OBI. And all of you, I hope you go forward and have a great week. Great, thanks everyone. And if you want to shoot me any separate questions that we didn't get to offline, I'd be happy to address them. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. All right, have a good one. Bye-bye.